I was raised in a classical Reform household. My parents were both raised in Orthodox households back in New York, but they had this sort of come to liberalism moment.
My father was an atheist. My mother came from a very secular family in Moravia. And so they didn't join a synagogue, although on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, my mother would go to services. My father would take me for a steak lunch.
I was raised in a modern Orthodox home, very committed to religion, to Israel, and to my identity as a Jewish person.
My mother's parents came from Russia. My dad's parents from Germany. But in New York, I had my grandparents, my grandfather and grandmother, and a couple of aunts and uncles.
My mom is from Canada, she's Italian, and my father is Persian Jew. So I grew up in a multi-religious house with Christmas tree and the Hanukkah at the same time. My father actually passed away when I was quite young, so I never had a bar mitzvah, so I am doing that soon.
My parents were born in Brooklyn. My grandparents were born in Odessa, Russia. We had an Orthodox upbringing, but modern Orthodox, until we moved to Vegas, and then we became conservative.
I grew up in Los Angeles from 1945 on. My parents were both born in the United States, my father in New York and my mother in Detroit.
I was raised in an extremely Reform household. I did have a bat mitzvah. We would go to temple on the high holidays, celebrate Passover, Hanukkah. And I went to Hebrew school, but just to study for my bat mitzvah.
We weren't terribly observant, but it's definitely in there.
I grew up in a family with a conservative cantor. My mom's a conservative cantor. My brother is a practicing Orthodox Jew, an agnostic, an atheist, some humanism thrown in there. Yeah, so I grew up with I would say I grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. And even though we all came from different backgrounds and a lot of different ways of understanding, I think we all strongly identify as Jews.
I was born in an interfaith family. So my mother is Jewish, my father is Catholic, and was raised with both contexts.
My family had very strong Jewish identity, but it was kind of on the left, and therefore, especially in terms of my very influential grandmother, my mother's mother, who was a socialist. We did not go to temple, but I lived in a very Jewish neighborhood. My elementary school was 80% Jewish, and my high school, Sen High School, similarly. So I had a very Jewish childhood, extremely, but I only started to go to synagogue when my friends were bar mitzvahed. Otherwise, I hadn't really been to synagogue.
I'd follow traditions, with my family. We'd celebrate Sabbath, Passover. As an adult, I don't do as much of the religious parts of it.
My parents were both born in California. My mother was born in Los Angeles. My father was born in the Central Valley of California. So we're kind of Sabras of California.
My family was not Jewishly affiliated at all. We didn't even go to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur like most American families. I think you would call us probably a bagels and lox family.
I'm from Los Angeles and grew up here, and my Jewish identity was not religious at all.
I was born in Montreal and was raised in the very large Jewish ghetto, the largest of all in America. My parents were very ethno-Jewish, not observant Jewish, even though my father was a Talmudic scholar and my mother was a famous poet and author.
I was born and raised and lived all my life in Los Angeles.
I was born in London while my father was studying medicine. They then came back and my father decided to join a practice in Rhodesia at the time with another doctor. and that's where my brother and sister and I were raised.
I was born in Tel Aviv, Israel, and my mother's a Holocaust survivor. She was born in Czechoslovakia, which then became Hungary, and then she survived Auschwitz. My father is from Poland, Russia. It also changed. They met in a displaced persons camp after the war, emigrated to Israel, where my sister and I were born. And then when I was 3 years old, we moved to Los Angeles.
I grew up in an environment in Los Angeles. I grew up in Beverly Hills, actually, that was mainly Jewish. You never felt uncomfortable with who you were being Jewish.
I was born in Los Angeles, 1952. And my parents were also born in Los Angeles. Their parents came from Lithuania and Romania and Poland.
At the age of 13, we actually got a visa and we left Romania via Greece, Athens, to Israel. I arrived in 1960.
I think that there was a strong Jewish cultural identity, but not Jewish religious identity in the family. We were Jewish, everybody knew we were Jewish, which was a problem for me because we were the only Jewish. And so I identified as, secretly other.
In high school, I ended up reading Exodus, and I would say it was probably a book that changed my orientation. I became very interested in my Jewish background.
I'm very much a part of the Jewish community that is temple-centric, and it's been a wonderful, rich source of friendships, ideas, observance. It's been a really significant part of my life.
I grew up in Israel and I saw the world in two different ways. Once as an upheaval and the other way was sanctuary, because I experienced so many wars and lost so many family members to those wars on one hand, and on the other hand, I saw the beautiful of bringing in many Jews from all around the world and integrating them into our society.
I was raised with first conservative, and then after my dad died, we switched to reform. And then for a long time, I was kind of nothing. So I came to photography during a time of great introspection. I wasn't happy. I was trying to find my way, something that I liked doing, that I could devote my life to. And that blended with my own feelings about being Jewish.
Everything I do is Jewish. Everything I do is as an artist. So everything that I do is doing as a Jewish artist.
I've always been an artist. I never feel a moment that there was a moment where it clicked and I said, I'm going to be an artist. I just always was.
I didn't study professionally at all, really. I consider myself self-taught.
I always had a leaning toward creative work, but I never was encouraged to take art classes, so I never took any formal training. Many of my friends were Jewish. There was a very large Jewish community, and we belonged to a shul together, and I took some little Hebrew classes, some confirmation classes, and just other than the high holidays, there was not much connection with the temple. But Friday night dinners with Grandma Bertha, and that was our connection.
When we talk about themes in my work, I think generational shame, generational cruelty.
Art to me, is an investigation, a solving of problems. And if you don't have a challenge, I think it makes life very boring. If you don't have a challenge, you can't get better at what you're doing.
I began to see the canvas as exploring my own personality, the various layers of all the things that had gone into making up who I am. And that's how the paintings then proceeded. Now, part of who I am and a very deep lineage is that I am Jewish for very many generations forever. And so the allegiance and the interest in the Hebrew language was just part of what eventually emanated.
My work is more about relationships, and you know, I build in music, and I build in nature, and I build in relationships between and among a couple, or romance and love.
I'm interested in my inability to be perfect. The tension that evolves when I set out to do something with perfection in mind, but because I'm not a robot, and because, you know, I shake, or if I've had too much coffee or whatnot, or however I'm feeling, the lines are going to be slightly off.
I love nature. I used to go out, at that time it was safe to do it in Los Angeles, work on location as a plein air painter, take my easels, and I did a lot of that.
I've been in the arts all my life. I was named after an actress, and I thought I would be an actress. So I studied theater, and then I moved in a rebellious way into performance.
I felt kind of attracted to structural and grids in work, and contrasts and color and shapes.
In all my blocks, I carve stories, and so one story always leads to a next piece, and I take elements from what I carve into my block, and they always move forward into the next block. So I feel like it's like tattooing my body. The story continues.
I just began studying the nature of light and what it does when it passes through translucent objects as opposed to solid objects, and a much more formalistic approach to what I'm doing.
In the context of the image, the paper was a painting and sculpting material, rather than just the vehicle for carrying an image that I created on top of it.
I'm a paper cutter, so I'm working in an art form that is traditionally Jewish, that Jews have practiced for hundreds of years, if not longer. Paper cutting is one of those things it's so easy. If you're a people on the move, all you need is something sharp and something flat. And you can, you know, whether there are pogroms coming or Nazis, like, you can practice your art and then pick it up and move it elsewhere. It's a bit of a joke, but it's true. It's an inexpensive and very accessible art form.
When I started, I would do a lot of non-representational, abstract, very colorful paintings that were not even remotely Jewish or Israeli or any connection to that I could see. And I did not want to be categorized as a Jewish artist at all.
The first phase of my work was exploring through installation what I saw as contrary to the American dream that I was raised with. How I didn't fit into this wife, mother, wanting to be a couple role model that my parents had raised me with.
My work now is more about, I'd say, more about metamorphosis and change and transformation. And I have really returned to an interest in nature, I think, as a subject, an environment. I'm interested in climate change and political issues like that.
If violence is in our DNA, is there any way to rewrite our DNA? And a lot of what I do is about how do we rewrite what's built into ourselves, how we got made.
For the past many years, my work has had to do with translucency and light and what that means in terms of defining space.
I started painting just in terms of layers of light and color, many transparencies, thinking about time and space.
I explore memory. I explore notions of fragility and absence and eradication. I think some of that stems from my lifestyle as an Orthodox Jew, and some of it also comes from my work as an occupational therapist.
I explore time, identity, and memory throughout all of my work, and I work across a lot of mediums. I call myself a cross-genre artist.
I actually began as a dancer as a child. I did ballet, which I think is essential to what I paint now, because very young, I sort of had this feeling of space. When I would perform, I felt there were molecules. I could already sense it at 8, 10 years old.
The figurative work that I do, which is based on old photographs that I found in old family photos, are faceless. And people always ask me about it because it's so obvious that there are no features on these people. And the reason I do it is to have more of a universal appeal so that the viewer can put their own narrative in it.
This look that I have is usually figurative, portraiture. It's to talk about the human emotion, definitely relaying what's going on around the world in a very symbolic way.
I'm a humanist, so I'm greatly interested in all aspects of humanity. I love to photograph children and the elderly. I call them the hopefuls and the hopeless.
When I first moved here, I felt very ungrounded and lost. So I walked around the streets of LA and the desert eventually, looking for roots and objects, which I began to use in my process, which is a complex process that lands me between photography and painting.
Cells on a plate, so it's almost a collage that's printed, and I move and I change.
I have came across a new genre of work, which I have called coffeegraph, and my life has been changed since then.
I started to create something called Notes from the Tribe, which is a series of 108 illustrations that cover the scope of contemporary Jewish American life.
I turned my studio into a cloud lab and worked with cloud-like forms that I built with materials such as the paper from tea bags. So there was a natural stain quality, was translucent but not transparent.
I paint, I draw, I do installations, video, sound work, not out of a restlessness, but more out of a search for the true way to bring a concept into the world. So if a work needs me to do it in sound, I will learn how to do a sound piece. If a work needs me to do it through movement, I'll do it through movement. And if the work needs to be a painting, it becomes a painting. I am in service to my work.